So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this AdoptUSKids webinar entitled Understanding Secondary Traumatic Stress for Parent Group Leaders. My name is Alicia Groh. I'm a consultant with AdoptUSKids. And in a few moments, I get the honor of introducing Sue Badeau, our speaker for this webinar, and she has great information to share with all of you. So I will be learning right alongside of you and hearing all of this great information that Sue will be sharing. I'm just going to get us set up for success for today and give you a little bit of housekeeping before today's session and before we hand it over. So today's webinar will be 90 minutes long, and we do have time built in at various points throughout the webinar and at the end for questions. So please feel free to submit your questions anytime you have them in the questions section of your control panel. We'll get to those as we can. If we can't get to all of the questions during the webinar, we can follow up with you afterwards as well. But we want to make sure to be able to have that kind of interaction and that opportunity for you to get your questions answered. We are recording this webinar, and so we'll post the recording after this webinar is completed. It'll be posted on our website at professionals.adoptuskids.org, and you'll also receive the link after the webinar once the webinar is posted on the website. So you'll have access to this for your future reference. You've probably noticed your phone lines and computer lines are muted, so we aren't able to hear from you. That way we don't have to deal with the background noise that may come up. But as I said, we do want this to be as interactive as possible. So in addition to the questions section where you can interact with us, we'll also have some poll questions that you can respond to. So we'll get a sense of who's here and get your perspectives on some great questions that Sue has for you. I do also want to let you know that, as with all of our webinars, we'll be evaluating this webinar. So you'll receive an email after the webinar from our AdoptUSKids evaluation team, and we ask that you complete that evaluation. It should just take a few minutes of your time. That information that we gather from those evaluations is really critical for our work. We continue to use it to inform our planning and our own improvement to keep making sure that we're producing really high quality and relevant webinars. So please do take a few moments to fill that out. I want to tell you a little bit, just briefly, about AdoptUSKids. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with our project. We are a federally funded project funded by the Children's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and we have a two-pronged mission for our whole project. The first part is to raise public awareness about the need for foster adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system, and the second part is to assist states, territories, and tribes in recruiting, developing, engaging, and supporting foster and adoptive families. And we do both parts of that mission in multiple ways, but it includes an emphasis on parent support, family support work, and specifically looking at helping support parent group leaders and develop your knowledge and skills and tools in your toolkit. So this webinar fits into that part of our work. We have several components to our AdoptUSKids project that you may be familiar with. In addition to operating the national photo listing and the National Adoption Recruitment Campaign that hopefully you've seen in various formats over the years, we have a call center that responds to inquiries from families around the country who are trying to find out more about foster and adoption. So we answer those calls and refer those families to their jurisdiction or to their state. We also have the capacity building and engagement team that provides tailored services directly to child welfare systems, providing that kind of consulting and helping them build their skills. Our family support team, which is operating this webinar, also provides that kind of information to states, territories, tribes, and parent groups and parent group leaders to really build that knowledge and capacity on family support approaches in particular, and really emphasizing the importance of peer support. We also have the Minority Professional Leadership Development Program, which we're very excited about, that helps develop the skills of minority, current and emerging leaders working in the field of adoption and permanency. And right now, the applications are open for the next cohort of those fellows. So if you or anyone you know is interested in learning more about that, please check out the AdoptUSKids website. Those applications are open right now, and they're due on June 8th. So that's our brief setting for information about AdoptUSKids. Now I'm going to hand this over to Sue, which I know is really why you all showed up for this webinar in the first place. So as many of you likely know, Sue Badeau is a nationally known speaker, writer, and consultant, and she's a former president of the board of directors of the North American Council on Adoptable Children and the current president of Justice for Families. She's also an adoptive parent and an experienced parent group leader. So Sue, I'm happy to turn this over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Alicia. And hello, everyone, and welcome. And we both are sharing our faces as well as our voices just for this introduction. We like to make it as personal as possible, and so you can see we're real people here coming to you live from our home settings. And but we will shortly, after this this slide here, we'll be turning off our videos just to protect that important internet bandwidth, so we all stay connected throughout the webinar. But it's great to be here with all of you. As I said, kind of when we were getting started, great to see people from so many places around the country. The goals for this webinar today, I wanted to start by saying that we really didn't know when we were planning this, because we planned this months in advance. We didn't know what exact moment in time we would be facing when we would actually be presenting this webinar. But we know now, and we know what challenging times these are for everyone, how every single person has extra levels of stress, increased risk of trauma or exposure to secondary trauma, and that we're all learning to navigate, either increased job responsibilities, losses in job-related activities, many different kinds of personal and professional challenges, not only for ourselves personally, but for the families and children that we all serve in our various roles and capacities. So this webinar is not specifically about the current pandemic and related situation and its impact, but it is about secondary trauma. So we hope that the material that we've planned and that we're presenting and covering today will be relevant and useful to you and meaningful to you as you really sort all this out and navigate these difficult times. So with that said, we did want to highlight what our actual goals that we plan to have for you today. This is a digging deeper. This is a part 2, if you will. We did do a webinar on secondary trauma and self-care for support group leaders some time ago. And so this builds on those foundational concepts. So we really want to give you an opportunity to have a little deeper awareness of secondary traumatic stress and how you can respond to that both for your own care as a support group leader, or those of you that are here who support the support group leaders in your professional capacity, and also how that relates to the group itself that you might be supporting. I will be, during the webinar, introducing a tool that some of you may already be familiar with, but even if whether you are or not, it's a great tool. It's called the ProQOL, and it helps people really think about a way to measure secondary traumatic stress and figure out strategies that are going to help you be on the positive track and sort of building in the capacity to cope in a healthy way with that stress. So then we'll be talking about some knowledge and skills that will be useful for you as you balance kind of meeting your own needs, your own self-care, your own reactions to secondary trauma, while also being attentive to and attuned with the needs and self-care needs of the people and participants in the support groups. Finally, I'll also talk about reflective supervision, which is a professional practice that, again, those of you that are here in your professional capacities may well be familiar with, but I want to talk about how it can be adapted for the use of support group leaders and your peers and your leadership network, so that it can help you really use a reflective practice to enhance and develop and deepen your own role as a support group leader and those connections between group leaders and co-facilitators that you may have, as well as then how that extends into your group. So those are our goals. I'm going to turn off my video camera and take it to the next slide where we are going to start with a poll. I think I am. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you for participating in that poll. And it looks like we have a nice mix of people. Other is the majority, so that's interesting and mysterious. But we do have a good number of foster and adoptive parents and kinship caregivers, a good core of support group leaders, and then those who are in a professional capacity or manages a program that provides support groups. So great mix. Looking forward to engaging with all of you as we go forward. So thanks for that poll, and now we'll come back to the slides. All right. And we'll move to the next slide, I believe. There we go. So as we get underway, and a few times throughout this webinar, I'm going to actually share with you some little tips and tools and strategies that you can actually start using immediately for your own self-care, and you can also use them in a group setting. And they relate to the content of the rest of what I'll be sharing about. In a group setting, we do these in, what we call circle time, having a circle at home. You can do it just on your own reflectively. You can do it if you're a journaler, you can write in your journal. These are good questions for first thing in the morning or last thing at night when you do them personally, and they're good either opening icebreaker type of questions in a group or something to kind of close out the group at the end of a session. But the first one I wanted to share is something I am thankful for today. And I would love it if you just pause and take a moment to think about something you are thankful for today. And share, if you're in another room, if you're in a room with another person, share it with that person. And if not, you're welcome to write your response in the question box, or just jot it down for yourself. I will also contribute something that I'm particularly thankful for today, is that I got to have a great video chat this morning with one of my grandsons, and it really got my day off on a good start. So as we get into our content of the understanding secondary trauma and then focusing on self-care and reflective supervision, I have created this sort of ABC way to remember it. And I like to use techniques like this to help make these kind of topics as easy to remember and actually use as possible. Because the thing is, with trauma and self-care tips, the times when we need them most is when we're least likely to really be able to remember them. But if we have them in some easy to remember format like ABC, then we actually are more likely to remember them and be able to recall them when needed. So we're going to begin with A, and A is for awareness. So what are we talking about in terms of awareness? Well, we want to be aware of a variety of definitions. We want to have understanding of what are we talking about anyway when we talk about self-care, when we talk about secondary trauma, all these different terms, and specifically understanding warning signs of when the anxiety level, when the stress level is building to a point that it maybe the self-care hasn't kept it in check and some additional steps might be needed. And we want to have that awareness of our own needs and warning signs, as well as that of individual people, sort of being able to be observant of individual people in our group, and then kind of the mood or the temperature of the group as a whole. And then having our toolkit, some ideas about, well, what are some general ideas that just help people, and what are some things that help me in particular, or that have helped in our specific group over time. So that's keep track, be observant, keep notes, and remember that as it relates to secondary traumatic stress, as a group leader, your goal is to be able to recognize your own well enough to manage it in ways that keep you mentally and physically and emotionally strong enough to continue to lead the group in a meaningful way, but also to know, when it is that I might possibly need to get extra support for myself, or even to take a break for myself. And the second goal is that we want to be able to recognize the secondary traumatic stress levels among our participants and within the group as a whole, so that we can support overall group wellness and also be able to identify particular individuals who might need a little extra individualized attention or support. So since definitions is one of the important things that we need, let's start by looking at some definitions. Yes, no, went too far. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, before I show you the definitions, I also had this initial definition of secondary trauma that I wanted to share. So the basic underlying definition of secondary trauma is frequent or continuous exposure to other people's trauma. So clearly many of us, if not all of us in the child welfare, foster care and adoption, kinship care realm can certainly relate that we're having frequent or continuous exposure to other people's trauma. But I love this quote from a friend of mine who also leads support groups and does a lot of amazing support work for people in very vulnerable situations. And she said her way of thinking about why secondary trauma is so impactful on us is it's not about that one really major, severe situation that you just can't forget, but it's about the 100 that you can't even remember. And just think about that. It's all those little continuous exposures, most of them that just kind of happen so frequently in our lives that we don't even remember them individually, but that's what is that frequent or continuous nature, almost a bombardment of exposure that leads to secondary traumatic stress. And certainly in our current external situation, we have increased likelihood of secondary traumatic stress symptoms for people in all walks of life. But this is particularly true for those who are already dealing with high levels of stress or anxiety or other ongoing or pre-existing trauma triggers. So that's who to be aware of that's particularly vulnerable at times like this. And so that, of course, would include many of us or those in the groups that we manage. Some other terms I wanted to give you a chance to look at in terms of definitions. And I want you to see clearly how this is kind of, two sides here. That often we think about secondary traumatic stress as really the challenging side. I mean, look at words like burnout, right? And compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. I mean, burnout and fatigue and stress, they all sound so heavy and so difficult. And they are. I mean, not to minimize it at all, they actually are. But I want you to look at the other side as well, that we are learning more and more about the fact that for those of us who do learn these coping mechanisms and are able to manage our own secondary traumatic stress, there's positives that can come from those experiences. We can deepen our empathy. Just as there can be compassion fatigue, there also can be compassion satisfaction that comes from helping others. Vicarious trauma is another way of talking about secondary traumatic stress. It's vicarious. It's something we experience by exposure to others. But there's also vicarious resilience. And I don't know if you've noticed that, especially lately, like people on social media sharing these really beautiful and good things that people are doing. And you get this sense of vicarious resilience from others. And then there's this beautiful that term that's not nearly as often used, but has been around for a while. It was first talked about by Tedeschi and his colleagues in the 1990s, and that's the idea of post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic resilience. And this is the idea that positive change and positive and transformative life change can be a result of surviving or getting through a major life crisis or traumatic event. And as they've defined it, and as it's been written about and studied since that time, it happens when we have deeper appreciation of life, deepening or enhancement in our relationships with others, a sense of optimism or hope or possibilities in our own life, recognition of our own personal strengths. Maybe even now during this time, you're becoming aware of strengths that you never knew you had, or things that you never really thought were strengths, but you've started to have to use them. And so now you're saying, oh yeah, maybe that is a strength and maybe I can build that even more. And even that sort of transformative spiritual change in sense of my understanding of my own being and my own relationship to the world. So as you look at these different terms, I just wanted you to be aware that there's growth and wellness that can come from this experience. I also wanted to highlight for you that there is a whole handout in your packet that for the terms on the left-hand side of the chart there, burnout and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and so on. There's a handout that kind of goes through those terms and tries to shed a little light on how they're related and yet how there also are some differences. And so I just did want to end this part of definitions by looking at the definition of resilience. And as you look at this definition of resilience, I really want you to hone in on these ideas that it's about thriving, maturing, and increasing in competence. And it's not just about some new thing that happens. And although we don't know a whole lot about resilience, actually, it's interesting that even though so much has been written about resilience in recent times, it's still sort of on the frontier of knowledge for science. We do know that it's not something you're either born with and you either have it or you don't. We know that resilience can be planted like a seed, it can be nourished and nurtured, it can grow, and so everyone has the potential and the possibility of experiencing resilience. Now, as we think about the impact that secondary traumatic stress can have on us, before I show you some slides and call your attention to some handouts about the impact, we're going to take a couple more poll questions just to see some of your own experiences with this. So I'm going to turn it over for a minute and ask if we can get those polls going. There we go.
Sue, while people are responding to this poll question, this is Alicia. I just wanted to chime in. I know we've seen a couple of questions or comments from some people saying they're not able to respond to these poll questions. They weren't able to select their option in the earlier one. There may be a difference depending on which platform you're using, if you're on a mobile device or a tablet versus a laptop. So we're sorry for that problem, but we will look into it. And if you want to provide your response, if you want to share it in the questions section, that's fine, or you can just think about your answer yourself. So I'll hand that back to you, Sue, and you can talk us through these next few poll questions as well. I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thanks. So yeah, hopefully most people can participate or and see the results when they're posted. So here we have the results of this poll before we go on to the next one. So when facing high stress situations, I lean towards, and these are two sides of a coin really. Do I get more spacey and have less concentration? Or do I get more rigid and really focused and want to be more perfectionist in my work? And you can see we have almost an even split in those two seemingly polar opposite reactions. Let's go on to the next poll. And it starts with the question sounds the same at the beginning, but the options are different.
And Sue, I'm going to jump in again here. Hopefully you won't have me keep doing this, but some people are saying in the chat or the questions that leaving full screen mode helped them be able to submit their answers for these polls. So if anyone's having trouble, you may want to try exiting full screen.
Great, and no problem with you jumping in. I'm a big believer in addressing things as they come up. Okay, so once again, we have two sides of the coin, polar opposites. Sometimes for some people, stress and secondary trauma makes you eat more or less healthy, and other people feel they have no appetite or just don't want to eat at all. In this group, it's not really an even split. It's about 2/3, 1/3. But again, you can see there's large numbers of people who react in both of those ways. Just one more of these type of questions, and then we'll move on. Again, the top of the question looks the same, but the options are different. Okay, and so this one shows us, again, two sides of a coin. That's for some people when facing high stress or secondary trauma, it leads to questioning of my faith or my beliefs, whereas for others, the exact opposite. It's a time when I really cling to my faith and beliefs, and it gives me a sense of calmness or strength. So again, in this group, we had sort of a 1/3, 2/3 split. Often you see that spread out differently in different groups, but just to be aware. So what's the reason that I asked for you to do these poll questions? We can bring up the PowerPoint again, thank you, and get us moving to the next slide, hopefully. There we go. So the reason that I wanted to have you answer those questions is so we could see, even in this sort of anonymous way in this large group format, how wide and the differences are. Secondary traumatic stress affects us across all these different life domains, as you can see listed on the slide here. And again, calling your attention to the handouts, there's a handout called Table 1 that actually lists these domains and gives under it a number of the types of very specific behavioral or emotional responses that you might have under each of these different categories. This is in our personal life. And then there's a similar type of wide range of types of impacts and responses that we might have in our professional life related to our own actual job performance, our own morale and that of those around us, the interpersonal relationships we have among people that work together, and actual behavior in the workplace or in the work setting, even if the workplace is home now. So there's another handout that gives much more detail for this, but I really did want to highlight that the responses to secondary traumatic stress are individualized, they're very across multiple domains, and that as you're recognizing your own symptoms, you may look at others and say, well, they're not really reacting in the same way I am, so they're probably okay. Or you might notice their reactions and not chalk them up to secondary trauma, but just think, oh, that person's being rude, or that person's being obnoxious, or non-compliant, or dysfunctional, or some of these kinds of terms that come to mind. And maybe we can, especially in a group leader role, take a step back from those kind of responses we might have when people are exhibiting these different signs and say, I wonder if that's that person's response to their own stress, whether it's primary or secondary. I wonder if that's how they respond. And that's a really valuable thing to be able to do just in life in general. It helps engender empathy and compassion, but it also is very critical in a group setting if you're really going to be able to sort of keep in check the temperature of your group so that you know how to manage the best interests of the entire group as well as individuals. And some things to look for that in particular lead to a triggering of either a primary trauma experience or a secondary traumatic stress response. Many different things can trigger those kind of responses, and several of them are listed here. This is not an all-inclusive list, but you can see from this list things you should be aware of in your own life. And also, as you're listening to the stories of those that you support in the support groups, or if you're a professional of the leaders that you work with and support, and even if you're here in your role as a family member, as you look not only at yourself but also at the other members of your family and your home. So there are situational things that could occur, as well as sensory things that can, in fact, lead to that response. And then this response often can look like the responses we associate with trauma. So responses to secondary traumatic stress and symptoms from secondary traumatic stress can very much mimic and look like the same as responses to primary initial trauma. And we often speak of those as fight, flight, or freeze, but I wanted you to just dig a little deeper on that and recognize that each of those words fight doesn't just mean get in a fist fight, although it can. Flight doesn't only mean run away, literally, although it can. And freeze doesn't necessarily mean just stopping dead in your tracks, although it can. That they have these other behavioral manifestations, and these are just a few samples. And interestingly, I actually was, I always would like to continue my own learning, and I was learning recently some additional tips on secondary traumatic stress from a leader named Dr. Robert Miller. And he identified that there are actually, he believes there's 5 trauma responses that he could start with an F, all of them: fight, flight, freeze. He added 2 additional ones that I think are quite interesting: flock and flap. And flock and flap, I think, are particularly evident sometimes in our small group or our, support group settings, right? Flock meaning that sometimes people just that overwhelming need to just be with other people, just come together when you're stressed. Now, some people isolate, so it's not to say everyone does that. Again, these are different responses different people have, but some just got to come together. And so you might notice that in your group sometimes, that more people come when there's heightened times of stress, or different people come that don't otherwise come. And then flap. He had this picture of, a whole bunch of birds on the ground, like just kind of flapping their wings around. They're not flying yet. They're not fighting yet. They're just in a frenzy. And I think sometimes we see that in our group settings too, when people are having trouble focusing or having trouble settling in, and they're just kind of in that frenzied mode. So be aware that there are some adult behaviors that you might actually see that are linked to these trauma responses. To help with this idea for awareness, the A that we're still in, I wanted to introduce and share with you the idea of using this tool called the ProQOL. So as I said, there may be many of you that are familiar with it already. You might have used it or seen it before, but for those who aren't or haven't, it's a tool you can get for free online. And we also did provide it in the handout packet. And it's a set of questions that I love it because it measures both that compassion satisfaction side as well as compassion fatigue, which are the terms they use to describe secondary trauma. They have those subscales there related to both trauma and burnout. And it is the most widely used measure that has been validated for many years and among many, many different people all around the world. And again, as I noted, it helps you understand both the positive and negative or challenging aspects of being a helper, being in that helping role, being that leader of a support group. So bear in mind, it's definitely not a psychological test. It's also not a medical test, so it's not actually a therapeutic type of evaluation tool. It's really for self-help. It's really for our own self-awareness, and then the awareness we can have in that group setting. It's sort of a initial screening. It's not something that we would expect to need to have a medical degree or a psychological degree in order to use it. So I hope that most of you have been able to get it in the handouts. And if you have, then you'll see that the basic tool includes 30 questions. For those of you who haven't looked at it yet, I'll just highlight a couple of the questions. So, one of them says, I am preoccupied with more than one person. Or another one says, because of my helping, I have felt on edge about various things. But another one says, I like my work as a helper. And the word helper is in every question, and in that you can insert your own role. So my role as a support group leader, etc. And there's just a simple 1 to 5 scale that you answer on. And then in the materials we provided is also the mechanism for scoring, and you can then get a score on, what's my compassion satisfaction level, what's my burnout risk, and what's my secondary traumatic stress. And there's some information in there that helps you understand and define those terms better. So the reason I wanted to share it with you, it's something you can use for yourself anytime. And I'm gonna, in a moment, as we go to the next slide, give you a few more thoughts about that. But it's also something that you can consider using in a group setting. You can consider using this within your support group to kind of help you keep that awareness level and keep the pulse, your finger on the pulse of what's happening within your group. So think about a couple of different ways if you did want to use it in a group setting. One option would be, giving it out or having people download it at 1 month or one time and saying, do this on your own time, think about it, reflect on it. And this is going to be a topic we'll talk about when we get back together. And that gives people the opportunity to pick their own time, their own space, their own, mental status of how they feel when they do decide to do this. And then they can collect their thoughts. They're not just right on the spot, and they can come back to another meeting and discuss it. Or you can say, we're going to do this all together. We're all going to just take it in the meeting at the beginning or at a certain time. And then we'll have maybe a break or a pause so people can digest a little and reflect, but then we're going to discuss it as a group. No one is going to be required to share their exact scores or anything, but just kind of how they felt about whether this process was enlightening, did it validate or underscore things they already sort of knew and understood about themselves, or was there anything surprising? So these are the kinds of things that you can talk about. I think there's pros and cons of doing it either way. I personally like to do it in the group setting and have everyone be together and have that conversation. I've even done that in conference workshops as well as in support groups. But some people feel a little kind of off guard or like ambushed almost if they have to do something like that in a group setting, and they prefer to do it on their own and then come voluntarily ready to discuss it. So the key thing here is knowing your people and how they are best likely to interact. But the goal behind using it in a group setting is to help all of your folks understand the value of sort of staying in touch with yourself and being able to measure your own temperature. So that's one of the goals. And the other, of course, for you as a leader, is to be able to get sort of that collective sense of the well-being of the group. But as with any tool, it's not really all that valuable if you just use it once. And by that I mean that if you've ever taken a baby to a doctor or been with anyone who did, you're familiar with this chart that's pictured here on this slide. You know that this is a growth chart. This particular one happens to be weight percentile for a boy from birth to age 36 months. And the particular dots are this specific child that's being measured. Well, what you know is that no one of those dots really tells you anything. Some of them are kind of low and then they get up higher, but that doesn't really mean much until you see them in a pattern. And then you and the doctor together, if you see them in a pattern, you can begin to know, is my child growing at a healthy rate? Is my child kind of on a good trend line? That's what's important. And so using an assessment like the ProQOL really is most valuable if you use it occasionally over time. And then you can see, am I having a trend? Am I having a trend line that's going in a good direction? Was I having a trend that's going in a good direction and then it changed? Is there something I need to recognize here and be aware of for myself when you do it yourself, or when you do it with a group? Again, we've been through maybe some difficult times. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes in terms of when a whole group goes through some challenges. And so, how are we doing? Let's sort of take our temperature as a group. So this is something that if you're going to use it all, I don't encourage just using it once and relying on one set of scores as being particularly meaningful, but rather that it's something you sort of use over time so that it gives you some idea of what direction am I going, or am I holding in a good spot, or is something happening that's kind of taken a turn in a direction I don't want it to be, and so it's time for a course correct. And that's both on the individual level and the group level. So this is something that really helps with this whole issue of awareness. And that was our A for awareness. We're going to move on now to the B category, which will be about balance. But before we do, I wanted to turn to Alicia and see if there were any questions that I could respond to at this time.
Yes, thanks, Sue. So we had one question come in. Oh, I'm getting an echo. One question that came in response to your discussion about the fight, flight responses and then the additional flap and flock that you mentioned. Someone asked, what about the fawn response, FAWN? Is that something you're familiar with?
No. That's going to
Yeah.
be a new one.
All right. So, so Kelly, who submitted that, if you're familiar with that, it'd be great if you could share a little bit more in the questions pod to let us know more about that if you do. And either way, I think we'll be looking into it after this so we can learn more about it. But that was
Absolutely.
the only, yeah, that
I
was the
love
only other question that come in for you, Sue. So I'd say let's keep going, and people can submit questions as we go.
That's great. I love learning new things, and I do love this idea that there's not just this strict, the more we understand the human brain and the more we understand the human capacity for absorbing and responding to both trauma, but also good things and healing things, we know that there's all these different pathways and all these different responses. And the more nuanced we can get about understanding that and even naming them, I think it's healthier that we can see, oh, we don't look at ourselves and, I don't quite fit that box. What's wrong with me? But rather we can say, oh, there's this continuum. There's these different possible responses. I'm somewhere in there, and others might be in a different place. So I think that's really what's great about sort of this continual learning and recognizing that there's new ways to express ideas that sort of emerged out of research, but as we get to the nuanced understanding. So thank you for sharing that, and I will be looking into it more. Now we're going to go on to our B for balance. And in this instance that we're talking about support group leadership, I wanted us to think about balance in these 3 ways. That you need to balance the needs of the group versus your own individual needs as a person, as a leader. You need to be able to keep in balance that idea of when we need to sort of keep things moving, keep things in a forward direction for the benefit of the whole group, versus those times when we really do need to stop and pause and reflect and have a moment. And sometimes that's just in a one-on-one relationship, we're having a moment, you've heard, but sometimes a whole group needs that time, and that takes a little more effort than sometimes it does in those one-on-one relationships. And then we also have to be able to notice when what the group needs most is sort of continuity and stability, and when something that might be healthy at this point in time might be some change. So these are 3 of the different ways I'd like you to think about this B for balance, and I'll be saying a bit more about each of them in the slides ahead. But before I get into describing those, I wanted to take us to our next circle suggestion. So again, great idea to use this in a circle time in a small group or a support group, small or large support group, and or use on your own individually, personally yourself, or in your home with your own family members. Again, these are good early morning, start your day off kind of reflective questions. They're good for the end of the day. And in a group, they make good markers of either a starting icebreaker or a closing exercise. But this one is, what is one of my greatest strengths or talents? And I positioned this one here as we get into this area where we're going to be talking about balance, because in order to really figure out where the balance lies in all those different areas I listed, we have to be able to know our own strengths and talents. Secondary traumatic stress often helps us to be very aware of our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses or our limitations. And that's useful to know that to some degree, but we also have to be aware of our own strengths and talents in order to take the right steps and do things that are going to be meaningful and useful. So I hope that now you'll take a pause to think about that yourself. Again, if you're in a room with others, you're on mute, so you can talk out loud in the room. You can share your own strengths and talents with people that are in the room with you. If you're by yourself, maybe write it down. If you want to share it more collectively, feel free to share your answer in the question box. Mine, I will share with you now, one of mine that I would answer, at least for today, is I've always considered myself a little bit of a translator, not from language to language. Well, it could be considered language to language, but not in the usual way. I often can take information from research or from academia and then translate it into nuggets that are meaningful and useful for everyday use, especially for parents and caregivers, which is what I consider my primary role in life. In spite of all my other, professional work, I'm a parent first and foremost. I'm a grandparent now. I'm even a great grandparent now. So that role I take is very important to me. And so the fact that I can read or go to a class or learn some of this important scientific information and then translate it into ways that are useful for me as a parent, and hopefully as I share it in these kinds of classes can be useful to others, that's what I consider a strength. So I hope that you will be reflective like that and think about your own strengths and talents. So as we now look a little more deeply at this idea of balance, let's first think about the tips you need for your own individual balance and self-care planning. Now, these tips are not only good for you, for yourself, but another point I'd like to make here is you might be in a position to help another individual member of your group develop their own self-care plan. So that's different than developing sort of a secondary trauma response for your whole group. This is if you do some one-on-one coaching or mentoring or just a little more individualized support with an individual member when it's needed. These tips are for you, but also for that person that you might be doing that with. Also, therefore, maybe for your co-facilitator or your leadership circle, other people that you might connect with in that way. So you want to think about, how do you use your time? Where do you need balance? How is your time being spent in ways that give you balance? And are you doing things over time, some little smaller things maybe on a daily basis, some slightly bigger things weekly or monthly, and then things that you do a little less often that are for your own self-care? Are you balancing and finding time in your day and in your week and in your life for self-care? And let me give you an example of what I mean from smaller to larger. This is a little review from our earlier original session on self-care. But if you're a person who likes to take a walk, but you don't have a lot of time between responsibilities with your job and your family and other activities, maybe you can't commit to walking 5 miles a day or some big chunk like that, but maybe you can commit to 15 minutes a day. And so your 15-minute walk every day is really part of your self-care. But maybe once a week, you can take that longer walk, maybe that longer, more leisurely walk, or maybe a longer, faster paced walk that's for fitness as well, however it works for you. But maybe you're going to take a 2-hour chunk on a weekend and really just get out there and walk, maybe doing it with another person. And then maybe once a year, you're going to sign up for a walkathon of some sort. And you're going to really extend that and do, a 20-mile walk or something. So that's what I mean about sort of figuring out how you use your time to do things that help you with your self-care that are parsed out over time. Now, this work-life balance idea, people are having a big struggle with right now in the current environment because so many of us are now working from home who may not have been doing that before. The lines between work and life are getting blurred. People are finding that they're actually working more than ever. And then other people are losing their jobs and not working at all. And so what you're experiencing yourself and what the people in your support group are experiencing might be very different in this way. But I would say that probably right now and for the next foreseeable future of months ahead, this whole idea of work-life balance is going to be particularly challenging. So you really want to have some awareness of that and be reflective about that. And then you want to think about self-care planning that balances your whole being. So things that you can do that use all different parts of who you are and that balance your need for time alone and to really self-reflect and just have time to be yourself, and then time to be in community and be with others. The next type of balance that we want to think about and look at is this idea of having balance in your group setting. So on a regular basis, you really do want to think about how you best structure and use self-care strategies in your meetings. And this is a good part of what we did talk about on the last webinar. So if you weren't, not the last one sequentially that AdoptUSKids did, but the last one that I did that had to do with secondary trauma, it's in the collection of webinars that are available, and there's some additional documents about it. I know that you'll hear more about those at the end, but this is something you want to think about. How do I structure my groups so that we're regularly doing things that benefit everybody's self-care? there's particularly a tip sheet that gives you both those sort of ongoing things you can think about, but also, as you see down below, those sort of quick fixes, on-the-spot ideas for when there is that heated moment or that somewhat crisis moment in the group. You definitely want to practice sharing the facilitation role to the extent that you're able to do that in your group, and sharing that leadership role with someone else. And then when you're not the one that actually is the facilitator, use that time to really observe the participants and just kind of, again, tune in to how they're doing. And take times to reflect, which we will be sharing some specific examples about real quick here in the next few minutes, especially when there actually is a crisis. And I'm going to highlight a few examples of types of crises, and then talk about some strategies to help you in a group setting to manage those crises so that you can, A, keep the well-being of the whole group in mind, but also so that you can pay attention to where then individual support might be needed, and then get some resolution to whatever the crisis might have been. So let me share with you a couple of examples. These are 3 real case examples that happened recently, since the time that we began planning this webinar several months ago. These have happened within that recent period of time. That's why I decided to use them in groups where the leaders had to really think about how am I going to help keep my group, from flying off in all different directions or disintegrating or getting into factions, and we're going to lose the support nature of a support group. So you can look at these 3 examples. Due to time, I'm only going to really be able to talk about one of them. What I'm going to do when we get to the next slide is I'm going to use the 3rd one that's listed here as an example to talk you through a strategic approach. But these are just types of things that happen. Sometimes you have a long-time leader that leaves for whatever reason, in this case moved away, and then you may have a new leader, but the group may not quite really be clicking with that leader yet, or that leader might not really feel I can take that role on yet. I still feel like I'm waiting for the other leader to come back or something. So that can be a kind of crisis situation. Our families are very diverse, right? And so we hope and work towards the goal that in our support groups we're very supportive of people's full humanity, and everything from race and gender and sexuality, religion, language, socioeconomic level, whatever other ways make us diverse. We hope that people honor and respect that within the group. But there's differences, and there's times when those differences can lead to a crisis within a group by things people say or do or behaviors that you see. And then this 3rd example here about a caregiver who was a regular member of a group, had been physically harmed, and I will say the case that I was involved with, very seriously physically harmed by a teenage foster child that was in her home. And so the whole group was really experiencing a lot of grief and loss over that. So these are the types of case examples I want you to think about and brainstorm, like how is secondary traumatic stress going to affect me as a leader of a group when I face these kind of examples? How is it going to affect my people, my group, when we're grappling together with these? And how am I going to lead the group through these storms or these trials or these difficult times so that we can not only get through it, but we can thrive through it. We can become stronger and better through it, and we can be a role model for each other, so that how we handle it in the group also provides an example to people in terms of how they can handle things within their own families. So I wanted to share with you this tool as one way that we can work through some of these kinds of crises. And I'm going to use that 3rd one that was on the bottom of the slide, and I'll read it out loud again, just so that you know what it is, and talk about how we use this tool to help kind of get through that. So this was a situation where a caregiver who had been a regular member of the group had been physically harmed by a teenage foster child in her home. So in this instance, first of all, an important step that was taken was they knew people were really grieving. There was a serious loss felt by the group. And so we brought in a grief specialist to help facilitate this special conversation to kind of cope with this crisis that had happened. And then we used a strategy where we asked people to first talk together in pairs. This is the 2 to 4 to 8 strategy, where first people talk in pairs, and then 2 sets of pairs talk to each other. So that's little groups of 4. And then 2 more sets of those groups talk to each other. So now you have groups of 8. And then you come back together as a full group. And during the what, they're talking about what happened here. You know, what was the situation? What did we learn and when did we learn it? Who was involved? Just the what of the whole situation, including what were our feelings about what happened and what's continuing to happen. So there's that time to talk about the what. Then the so what has to do with, why does this have meaning for me? Why is this important to me? Why is this, why does this matter for us to take time in our group to talk about this? And so people can really express why this is important, how it's affecting them, how it's affecting relationships or beliefs, or how cultural views might be entering into it, or issues with the system. Just what's the weight, what's the meaning of this for us? And then there's the now what. Okay, we've described it, we've sort of understood how we feel and what the meaning is for us. So now what are we going to do? What do we think needs to happen next? What are some next steps? And in that next steps piece, each person is encouraged to think about, what will help me to get through this? What do I need? What will help the person who was most harmed in this situation, in this case, the foster parent? And then what help do we think our whole group needs as a whole to heal and move on from this? Just so you know, in this particular case, at the end, the group felt that they also needed to understand, how can we talk to our kids in our home? How can we talk to the children and the teens about what happened? And so they immediately decided to schedule an extra session of their support group that would happen very soon after that first one, where they would bring in someone that could help guide them through, you know, tips and tools for how to talk to children. So that's just one idea of a way to use a tool like this, and it's something you should practice sometimes, maybe when it's less of a crisis, just sort of the what, so what, now what, even with a role play or with a lighter situation, you know, practice it a few times now and then with your group so that you will have the capacity to use it when you really do have a crisis situation. And then you want to be able to debrief it. Initially, the debrief might be with your leadership team, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our C, which we're going to get to shortly. But eventually, you will want to do some debriefing with the whole group. And so here are just some questions to think about as you do that debriefing with your group, you know, helping people think about what their thoughts and beliefs were, feelings, and behaviors, because trauma and secondary trauma affects us in all these different ways. How I think about it, how I feel about it, what did I do? And then we also want to notice, and what helped? Was there something someone else did or said that helped me and helped the group? And so then I wanted to introduce you to this other, sorry, I went too far. I wanted to introduce you to this other tool, and you can see that where it comes from there, the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. So you can learn a lot more about it there if you want to look it up. But it's a tool called a critical success analysis exercise. And that could take a whole workshop in itself to really help understand what it is. I have 2 slides about it here in about 2 minutes because I want to make sure we have time for our other remainder of our topic. But I wanted you to be aware that this is a tool that once you've kind of gotten through some of these secondary traumatic events within your support group, you want to have that time to step back as a group and recognize, hey, we had a success here. We got through something that was hard. Now you can also use this to not only when you got through something hard, but when you accomplished a goal, like you had a big public, you know, event, you had a fair, an adoption fair in your community or something. So you can use the same strategy for doing a critical success analysis, other successes you've had as well. But you really identify that shared experience of success and really pay attention to what made it successful. you use a timeline, you use Post-it notes, you use some questions that are coming up on the next slide here. Whoops, too far again. And you think about, what made this a success? And this is really valuable, not just for your group's ability to then have other successes, but it's valuable and it comports with the research around healing from and thriving from and getting more into that resilience and post-traumatic growth phase after experiencing trauma and after experiencing secondary traumatic stress. Focusing on successes, understanding what makes something successful, and then knowing that you have a way forward and sort of taking the lessons, that's way more beneficial for the overall process of healing and thriving and growth than obsessing over or overanalyzing things that went wrong, which is what we more likely tend to do. Frankly, it seems human nature. Oh, something went wrong and we're going to analyze it to death and figure it out and try to learn from it. I'm not saying you should never do that, but the evidence really is quite clear that it's a better strategy to use that kind of energy to focus on and analyze when things go well, that helps you prevent other problems more in the future, but also helps you to have more successes. So we are going to move on to our letter C because we want to make sure we allow time for it. And again, before we do, I wanted to ask Alicia if we had any questions now that I should respond to.
We don't have any right now, so you can keep on moving through, but I encourage everyone to submit questions if you have them, and we will get to them during our session at the end of the webinar.
All right, sounds good. Well, we've talked about awareness and being aware both for yourself and for individuals within your group and for the group as a whole. We've talked about having balance in a variety of different ways, including balance within yourself and balance for the group. And now we're going to talk about C, which is for connection. And the ways I want us to think about this C for connection is how you connect with one another just regularly, but also the importance of being able to recognize when you need support or recognize when people within your group need additional support beyond what the group setting is able to provide. And then I'm going to talk about this specific practice of reflective supervision and how that can be applied in the support group environment to help leaders of support groups be able to make meaningful connections that help you cope with your own secondary traumatic stress and be more equipped to support the needs of the group as a whole. And of course, before we get into the content, I wanted us to one more time think about one of these circle activities. And so I've shared with you now twice why I think these circle activities are valuable and how they can be valuable both for yourself as a person as well as for your group. So I won't reiterate that. I'll just mention what this particular one is, this question. Someone I can turn to for support. Can I identify at least one person that I can turn to for support today? This is a really great question to ask every day or every time you get together with a group because it's important all the time to recognize, you know what, no matter how hard things are going, no matter how much trauma I'm dealing with or secondary traumatic stress I'm dealing with, I'm not alone. I can identify at least one person who can support me. And that's so important and so valuable all the time, but even more so in the times we find ourselves in right now. Because this term that's been circulating called social distancing, first of all, is a poor choice of words. We shouldn't be socially distancing. We have to be physically distancing. But socially, we still need to be connecting. But people are feeling isolated many times and distant and disconnected. And that's why it's even more important than ever for us individually and then for the members of our group to take that pause and reflect and think about, who can I turn to today if I need support? And just as I've been doing with the other questions, I'll tell you that I have an answer of my own, and then I encourage you, as I have with the other questions, to reflect on your own answer, say it out loud, say it to another person, write it in the question box. express it in some way. So I have two answers to this for me today for this specific webinar. It's a great team behind the scenes. You get to hear me doing most of the talking, but there's a great team behind me, and I know I can turn to any one of them for support if I need it in the midst of this webinar. And also on days when I am doing teachings like this, one of my best supports is my daughter, one of my daughters. I have many daughters, but my particular daughter, Chelsea, because she also is a trainer and a teacher, and she's way more savvy about technology than me. So I always know that I can turn to her for support for things like this if I need it. So identify your person or people that you have today in your corner. So as I mentioned, I'm going to, for this C part of our time about connecting, I'm going to introduce this idea of reflective supervision. Again, a practice that probably, given that original poll we did with how many of you are here in professional capacities, it's probably a practice you're familiar with, but I'd like you to think about how you can adapt it and how it can be meaningful for use by support group leaders, and sort of developing that reflective practice model of support group leaders having that peer support in order to both address their own secondary traumatic stress and stay on a path of wellness and well-being, but also to be able to then be equipped to do that with their group. So there's good evidence that reflective supervision as a practice has a lot of benefits. It reduces secondary or vicarious trauma. That's the main reason I'm sharing it with you today. It also reduces turnover in settings where it's used, so in agencies and in social work practices and in Head Start programs. And so although it hasn't been studied specifically among support group leaders, I believe it would be a useful tool to help with leadership turnover, or reducing leadership turnover. And using a reflective practice, supports a sense of group identity and culture. It definitely contributes to the development of your leaders, and then it definitely supports the outcomes you want among your leaders. So the ideas that I'm going to be covering on these next few slides are ideas that you can use as a support group leader with your group and in your group setting, but the focus I have right now for this next few series of slides on this topic, I really want you to think about using it in that peer-to-peer way with other support group leaders. Your co-facilitator, if you have one, and I hope you do. Your leadership team, if you have one, and I hope you do, whether that's the program manager at an organization or a funder or agency that sponsors your support group. Maybe there's some other support group leaders, even if they lead support groups on different topics in your community that you can meet with in person, or maybe you can have that virtual connection, which certainly is provided through AdoptUSKids and partner organizations, that you can get that support that way through what's offered by AdoptUSKids and NACAC and other support organizations. So this is really meant to be that peer-to-peer type of support for leaders. What is it anyway? Well, you can read the definition here. I'm not going to read it out loud to you, but I want to highlight some of the words which you can see I highlighted in color and bold and things, because the idea here is that there's a regularity to the idea of stepping back and being reflective. So not something to just do once or twice, but something to do on some kind of regular basis. And then that you are examining personal and professional responses, but there's a purpose. So regularity, I highlighted it with a color purpose as well. There's a purpose of doing that it's going to help with future actions. And so it's not just ruminating, it's not just, kind of a chat session, not that there's anything wrong with those in and of themselves, but that there's a particular purpose for using this approach. And reflective supervision as a practice has what are known as, has been written about as the 3 building blocks. And these are reflection, collaboration, and regularity. So I'm going to just talk briefly about each of those, and again, specifically try to talk about how it adapts into the support group environment. So the first block is reflection. Reflection means taking some time, like I said, to get together, whether virtually or in person, whenever we can do that again, with 1 2, 3, a small group of peers, or your mentor or your coach or your supervisor that helps support and manage you in your role as a support group leader. But it should be intimate, it should be small. You have that small connection. Remember, we're in C for connection. You have that small connection, big connection, but with a small number of people where you can really take a pause, take some time and be reflective. And in that process, you're going to do, hopefully there's going to be some mirroring happen. What do we mean here? In 2 ways. That each of you, as you describe, as you talk through things that are happening, concerns you have, challenges you have, successes that you've had, questions you have about things that are coming up, you're each using that sort of active listening where your responses show that you're kind of mirroring back to each other, reflecting back to each other what you're seeing, hearing, and observing. But there's another meaning here of mirroring as well, where the person who's sort of the mentor or the coach, or the one who's kind of giving the support to the other person in a peer-to-peer way, you can each take this role at different times, is in their responses mirroring how, kind of a role model type of mirror, how I would like to see you be able to respond to that person in your support group you're having trouble with. I'm kind of role modeling that for you, so you then can kind of look into me as your mirror. I can kind of be a mirror that's showing you an example of how you could possibly respond to that person or that situation. And then, you know, showing empathy and making sure you support self-care for others. And so when thinking about empathy, just remember that, and this, I just highly encourage becoming familiar with a lot of Brene Brown's work on empathy in particular to help highlight this, but that empathy isn't so much about, you know, rescuing someone or pulling them up to your level, as those top 2 illustrations might suggest, but more as the one on the bottom, that you're coming together as co-equals, you're coming together in a space of heartfelt compassion and meaning, and being able to share something that's really meaningful to both parties, or all 3 if there's 3 of you. The second block, building block, for reflective supervision and for this connecting in a way that helps you cope with your secondary traumatic stress and thrive, is to do collaborative problem solving. Now, previously, when I gave you the suggestions for how to do that in a group setting, that was for in the group setting. But now I want you to think about, how do I do this in this peer-to-peer mentoring coaching setting that I can have with another support group leader or someone that can mentor and coach me through that. So you want to, during this process, you want to be able to define any issues or challenges and set some goals. What do I hope can come out of this? And then what are some possible solutions that we want to make sure get us to those goals or to those solutions? And some of the ways we can do this collaboration is by, these are just some strategies for getting to collaboration, rather than someone saying, do this, try this. You know, it's not for the supervisor, it's not for the mentor, it's not for the coach, it's not for the peer-to-peer colleague to say, oh, that's your situation, here's what I think you should do. But it's rather that together you're doing this collaboratively. So things that give that more open feeling to them, that more open space to them, such as brainstorming together. What are all the possible ways we could imagine handling or coping with this circumstance or this concern? Asking open-ended questions like, well, what do you think worked best when you faced something like this before? Not a yes or no, it's not a, you know, true or false, it's really open-ended. What if questions give you the opportunity to share curiosity and a sense of wonder? And actually the word wonder is a great way to think about it. Like, I wonder what would happen if you tried this approach. Or I wonder how your group would react if this. So it is a way that you, as if you're in that role as the supervisor or the mentor or the coach or the peer that's supporting another peer, it is a way you can sort of get your own suggestions or tips in there, but you're not doing it in a directive way, like here's my advice, take it, go run with it, but rather you're doing it in that that curiosity way that helps it, again, be open-ended. Role reversal is a form of role playing, but where you say, okay, you be that, you be that problem person in your support group, and I'll be you, and let's try to see if we can, you take the opposite role of what your usual role is, and I'll take the role of you, and we'll sort of try to figure this out together. And then, of course, there's standard role playing. But anytime you go through any of these collaborative problem-solving strategies, don't forget that throughout the whole process, still to be showing empathy and expressing empathy. And as you're doing that collaborative problem solving, one of the things that might come up is this question I raised during the balance section as well. Is it time for continuity, or is it time for change? Is it time for me to just get the support I need and keep going, or is it time for me to take a break? And the me I'm talking about here is you as a support group leader, thinking through this, but thinking through it reflectively with someone who supports you. So remember that's in life, there's no shame in taking a break from something, no matter how passionate you are about it, no matter how called you are to it, no matter how good you are at it. Sometimes we all just need a break. And if you're able to take breaks from time to time and then come back into the work, you're also setting a great example for your support group participants, because you know what, there's going to be times when they need to take breaks. They need to utilize respite. They need to do whatever works for them to take some self-care breaks for themselves. So again, you can be a model as well as attending to your own well-being. So you want to think about times to have kind of planned breaks, as well as how you will respond if you need a break as a result of a crisis. So a planned break would be, maybe when you can share and go back and forth, have a rhythm of alternating roles with a co-facilitator, or a time when you do more stepping up and stepping back, and maybe you completely step out of the role as a co-facilitator for a selected intentional period of time and then step back in. When there's a crisis taking break, excuse me, you weren't able to necessarily plan it in that way, but you still want to ensure that there's open communication with the group, that it's not a mystery, that you suddenly don't just disappear one week and are never heard from again. And even if you have to disappear because of a health reason or something else, that there's a good communication line so that those who are still in the group can hear information that's consistent and that's comforting and assuring, although authentic and sincere at the same time. But it's not a mystery, and that there's some game plan or timeline. And if there's not yet a timeline you can share, there's steps you're going to take in order to have a timeline. So just processing this again in a reflective way will help you know, when do you need those times for taking a break. So the third block of reflective supervision is regularity. And this applies both to your group itself, and we did address this in that other webinar that I've mentioned a couple of times, the idea of having regular meeting times, regular structure for your meetings, linking new discussions to past discussions. But I want you to think about it here in terms of how you have that regularity in your peer-to-peer support time. So as you, as a support group leader, have some regularity and some structure in ways that you receive and give support with other parent group leaders. And so getting close to the end here. I just love this visual of all these great words, but it's just a reminder that when you are use those reflective tools, they do help build a sense of vision, they build hope and optimism, and that leads towards building the resilience and the post-traumatic growth that I talked about during the definitions. So I am going to end us with one last circle question and then open it for questions. So the last circle question is to think about something I'm looking forward to this week. And again, just as I said with that last slide, it's so important to have a sense of hope and optimism as a recovery mechanism and a coping mechanism for secondary traumatic stress, to know that everything is not doom and gloom, there's something good I can look forward to. And it can be something as small as, I'm looking forward to the smell of my morning coffee. One of my sons, who's an excellent cook, texted me today and told me he's going to bring me some of his homemade Japanese curry tomorrow. And so that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm also looking forward to your questions, and that's what's next. So I'm going to turn it back to Alicia, and we'll see what we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. And I say in full sincerity that one of the things I was looking forward to this week was this webinar and getting to hear you dive into this content. It's really exciting to get this chance to hear your insights and these great tips. So I've joined you all back on the with my webcam so we can have a little bit of discussion time here. And thank you for the questions that you all were submitting and the comments you were submitting. We don't have a lot of questions for you, Sue, I think because you did such an amazing job presenting on this. We had one question that someone then said you answered it, but I'm going to go ahead and push for a little more. So the question, I think it's so important, is what are suggestions you have for people who don't have a good support system? And I'll add beyond what you covered in that connections section, because you really dove into a lot of that. But is there anything else you would add to that in terms of suggestions for people who don't have a great support system?
Yeah, it's really critical. Often it can feel so isolating and alone to think that you don't have a support system. So start small. I mean, start with just that number one. Like, can I think of one person that I can turn to and develop this sort of supportive relationship with? And if you're a support group leader, ideally, one of your support network could be another support group leader, so you can have that peer-to-peer contact. But it can be a neighbor. It can be, like I said, in my case, and for this, it was one of my daughters. So just start with one and then begin to build from that and ask that person who their support network is. And so it gives you some different ideas. Oh, maybe they've got it, not that you're going to have their exact same support people, but they might say, oh, I have a support person from my gym or from church or something. It starts to give you other ideas of where you could look in your own life for your support network.
That's great. Thank you. I'll put out a last call for any questions that people want to submit. I know we had a couple of questions about just getting the PowerPoint presentation sent out to people. We can certainly email that out, but also I want to make sure people know it's the materials that Sue mentioned, the presentation and the other handouts are in that handouts section, should be on your screen. So you can download those now, but we can also send those out. I believe they were also sent out in the reminder email or an email to everyone who had registered for this webinar. So hopefully we can get those to you one way or another. You can get all these great materials. So I'm doing one last look. I don't see other questions for you right now, Sue. So I think you get to take a breath and take a drink of water or coffee, whatever you prefer. And I want to thank you for that great presentation. So we're just gonna wrap up here quickly and make sure we end on time, since you all probably have things to do. One thing that I wanted to highlight is that this great webinar from Sue is part of a whole series of resources that we have available at AdoptUSKids, and I'm trying to get our slide to advance. Here we go. So we have extensive resources. I know Sue mentioned a previous webinar that we've done that really kind of led into this one. We have tip sheets, discussion guides for parent group leaders, other webinars that we've recorded, great sets of materials. So we encourage you to access these. All of our services and materials are free. We want to make sure people know that. And we've just put out in the chat or in the questions pod for you, there's that link that we have posted on the screen directly in case you want to copy and paste that or go to it right now and start looking through our other great resources. We encourage you to do so. Also, I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that AdoptUSKids has a lot of services available. A lot of what we can do is provide these free capacity building services. So that's consulting, coaching calls, strategizing with you to help build capacity of your parent group, of your child welfare system, of your agency. So that's one key way that we can help you. We also have a peer-to-peer group for child welfare system administrators and other leaders to help them look at really strengthening and continuing to implement family support services. So we encourage people to explore that if you're interested in joining, and to look at all the other great resources we have on our website. I also want to mention again that we have applications open for our Minority Professional Leadership Development Program, and that those applications are being accepted until June 8th. So if you or someone you know is interested in that, you can find out more on our website, and it's a great opportunity, and you get to be part of a whole network of people who've been part of that program in the past, so a great alumni network. And as you'll see on the screen, you can also sign up for our free newsletters. So we have information about announcements of upcoming webinars, when we release new tip sheets and publications, and other great information to help you with your work. So if you want to reach out about any of the things we've discussed in terms of the resources and ways that AdoptUSKids can help, you can be in touch with Britt Cloudsdale. She's our program manager for our family support team. So her email is on the screen and her phone number. You can also feel free to email that consultation@adoptuskids.org email address if you have other questions about our services. If you're not sure who to reach out to either of those points of contact and we'll get you to the right place. So I want to thank you all again for your time and your great engagement, great chat involvement, and people sharing their strengths and what they're looking forward to. It's been wonderful. I also want to thank you for all that you all do for children and families and for all the people that you're supporting. I hope that you're able to really take so much of what Sue shared today and put it to use for your own self-care and for thinking about supporting others. So again, please be on the lookout for a link following this webinar very soon in your email for our evaluation. And please respond and let us know what you thought of the session and give us any other feedback so we can continue to build on our services. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.